I went to Pace University. It's a big college now. Back then it was called Pace College. They had a payment plan where you had to pay half the tuition for the semester, when you register, and then you had two payments after that. So I had the first half and I paid that. I had no idea how I would pay, the other two payments. That's the way it works. You just have to step out on faith and do it. So I did it, and now here I am, many decades later.
Welcome to the Immigrant Experience in America, an immigrant human library, where we amplify and humanize the experiences of immigrants in the United States and around the world. Listen in as we add another story to our immigrant human library. Hello, friends, and thank you for joining us on another episode of the Immigrant Experience in America, where we amplify and humanize the experiences of immigrants living in the United States and around the world. Today, we have another thrilling story to add to our immigrant human library. It is that of Dr. Glen Laman. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful to have you here on the show. I was happy when you reached out, and we're looking forward to hearing more about your immigrant story. So if you don't mind telling us a bit about your background, as much as you'd like to share, we will be posting your professional bio in the show notes for others to read.
Oh, okay. I was born in the parish of St. Anne, otherwise known as the Garden Parish. I grew up in the town called basically Claremont, a suburb of Claremont, I guess, called Coltott Grove, which is about a mile from Claremont. But I like to tell people that my grandmother's house was at the 1 mile post, and 8 miles down the road was where Bob Marley grew up.
Really? How neat.
Yes. He grew up in 9 miles in the same road. So I'm sure he passed my house. I just didn't know him at the time. So that's my claim to fame. So for the first 10 years or so, I lived with my grandmother and my great-grandmother's house. My great-grandmother checked out when I was around 8, I think. And then my grandmother, she hung in there a few more decades. So on my mother's side, she can trace her father's folks came from Ireland. I think the story goes that an ancestor would come on a ship to Orocabessa in St. Mary. And it was a supply ship. And then on one journey, he just decided to stay. And then he got married and hung in there and so on. So that's her father's side. On her mother's side, though, they go back, I'm not sure, but they're probably from, and my great-grandmother, she could tell you stories about slavery days and so on from her mother's story. So that's that. My grandfather actually is Chinese. He came from China in the early 1900s. And he actually came as an indentured servant, believe it or not. They actually had indentured servant well into the 20th century. And he worked on a plantation in St. Mary. And when his contract was up, he opened a shop. And then he was doing so well, he sent for his son in China, who was my father, his son and his wife. And then they had they were there for a while. And my father eventually went back to China. And he left my father with, the business. And my father's first wife died. He had a family. And then later on, I came along. Unfortunately, my father inherited 2 shops from his father, but he became a compulsive gambler. And it wasn't long after he had lost both shops. So he really didn't have anything. And that's why I kind of ended up in Claremont, living with my grandmother. And then I only saw him occasionally.
And when you say shop, are you referring to grocery stores?
Yeah, grocery shop. Typical what we call a Chinese shop in Jamaica.
Yes.
The shop that sold everything. So he had 2 of those and then gambled it away. And I think he made several attempts to get back on his feet. I think at one point he had a shop and money, and then he lost that again. And so the next time I engaged with them, my mother had gone away to Kingston, and I heard they were together. And then I would go visit on some vacations. And then he had a shop, he had a restaurant in Kingston. So it looked great. And my mother said, you can come and stay with us. We got a business now. So I went back home and I finished up my school year and packed up and I went to Kingston. But guess what? When I went back, there was no shop. Yeah, they had moved and everything. They were just, basically struggling. And I think, but luckily for me, I won a free place to high school in Kingston College, KC. But every year we moved. And even one time, I remember we got evicted. Well, in those days, they didn't really evict you. What they did, they had a company that would come to your house and take your furniture for payment of rent. So that's what happened to us. So we kept moving every year. Never made any friends like in high school, you know. So I remember now my early childhood was a country boy hanging out with the goats and the chickens and the pigs and so on. All of a sudden, I'm in a big city, very exciting. But we kept moving every year, so I never really made any neighbor friends and so on. And then to top it off, when I was 15, so he died, and then we were homeless. So my mother, her mother, and I stayed around in Kingston to finish up my high school. So it was a little traumatic.
And how old was he back then?
When he was considerably older than my mother, because remember he had a family already and a whole nother set, and they were all adults already. He was in his 50s, so late mid 50s.
And so now you're with mom and at Kingston College and trying to figure things out.
Yeah, well, I was alone because my mom went back to live with her mother, and my two sisters at the time. He had two more kids. They had two more children, so that's the way it was.
How did you finish school then when your mom went back to live with her mom?
My mother had a friend who had a boarding house, and that there were some other students there, and other people would rent a room or whatever, and I lived there. And my problem was I couldn't always pay the rent, so I had to sneak out because I didn't want her to see me. But sometimes she'd complain that people aren't paying their rent, and I knew she was talking about people like me. But she never kicked me out, so I got to give her credit. She was very kind. She was very, she did a good service, and she even had adopted some kid that was discarded, and she took him in and raised him. So people were like that in the day. People were very, very generous like that.
I've heard a lot of stories in Jamaica of people raising other kids, other people's children.
Believe it or not, this was a white boy. I don't know. He was a young kid, and he had some growth problems, but he lived there. I remember his name was Dickie, and he was like just a fun kid. But he didn't have any relatives. He didn't know didn't have any background to speak of.
And so how did you get from that point? I'm sure you finished Kingston College.
Yeah, at one point I actually considered quitting. I wanted to. It was so difficult. I thought about leaving. At that point, though, my brothers from my father's first marriage, they helped me a little bit. They had a small business, so they gave me a job. But I felt so much pressure that I felt I should get a real job, where I could work all week. But I hung in there. I was actually offered a job, but I didn't take it. So I hung in there. And then after that, I went to work mining when it was Jamaica Mine, the bauxite company. Yeah, so I lived with my grandmother for a year. I did that. But then I had an uncle who had migrated to the States. And he told me, well, you can come here and there's opportunity. So I was in communication with my uncle, and he told me, well, got a student visa. And next thing you know, I'm hanging out in Brooklyn.
Nice. So you got a student visa. That's awesome.
Yeah. So I took a course in computer programming, but I couldn't get a job.
This was when? Back in the 19...
This is back I came in 1969. So, early, in the 69 year. So I decided to go to college, and that was always my ambition anyway. My idea was to work and go to college, but they always say you could, work at night, go to college in the day, or vice versa. So that was my plan. So that's what I did. I enrolled. I found the cheapest college, signed up, and they took me. So, and the funny thing was, this college, I went to Pace University. It's a big college now. Back then it was called Pace College. They had a payment plan where you had to pay half the tuition for the semester when you register, and then you had 2 payments after that. So I had the first half, and I paid that. I had no idea how I would pay, the other 2 payments. That's the way it works. You just have to step out on faith and do it. So I did it, and now here I am, many decades later.
That's the immigrant mentality, right? You do what you need to kind of survive.
Yeah, but I was determined to survive, as you say. I remember my first job. My first job was loading a delivery truck in the mornings, and I remember there were two Jamaicans that signed up, myself and another guy, and there were three Americans. And the second day, all the Americans quit. And they said the work was too hard. The Jamaicans hung in there. So there's a lesson right there, right? We were on a mission.
So you got to Brooklyn as a student on a student visa because there was an uncle who provided support and started working. And how did life develop from there?
Well, so one day there was a group of Caribbean students. There was one guy from, I think, Martinique, and he was always well dressed, and everybody has had some kind of work. And so he's told us that he was on scholarship, but he had to keep his grades up, so he couldn't work. So I said, well, how do you get this scholarship? He said, well, just go to the registrar and tell them you are interested. So I went over there and I said, hey, I hear there's some scholarships, then they could get one. I signed up, and next thing I know, they gave me half a tuition. So
wow.
It was like a magic. Yeah.
At pace, right?
Yeah. So that was pretty cool. And then what I did, I worked in a hospital in the kitchen. I mopped floors and washed the dishes. And that was actually a pretty good paying job. I did that every evening. I would dash out. My last class, I would dash out and catch the subway to Brooklyn and then go work in this hospital. And then on Saturdays and Sundays, I'd work a whole day. And so that's kind of how I.
And how old were you then? Maybe around 19, 20, 21?
Yeah, 19, 20. Yeah, back in. So it worked out. But then halfway through that, I went home to Jamaica for a weekend. And remember I used to work at the bauxite company?
Yes.
So just a weekend, and I saw that a friend of mine who also worked there, and he said, oh, they have this scholarship. I said, oh. He said, you should apply. I said, what? I'm not going to be here. I'm going back on Sunday. He said, well, just write something. I'll take it in for you. So I wrote my thing, an application. And luckily, I had my college papers, my acceptance and all that. So I sent that in with them. And next thing you know, they offered me a thing to pay the other half of my tuition. So
while you were in school in another country?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, well, it was an American company, so they didn't care where you went.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So had I gone to like UWI, that would have paid everything, board and room and everything. But in America, it's just paid half my tuition. Because I think my friend actually got one of those, and he went on and studied medicine, and they paid the whole thing for 5 years.
That's amazing.
So, yeah, that was a good deal for him. Yeah, and for me too. I was really very, very happy.
What was it like back then as a young person with no cell phones, no internet, no social media? How did you guys network? What we call network or share information. It seems that your friends were sharing information. Like, give us a sense for what that was like for you when you were younger.
There was telephone. Of course, we didn't have cell phones, so you could borrow phones. Usually, most homes had a phone, and so of course you have to catch the people when they're there. In the case of how I got the job, another friend called me and told me that his cousin was going for this job, and that's how I ended up going. But yeah, pretty much you leave a message, call and leave a message. That was it. And pay phone, it was a dime to make a call in those days. Funny story is one day, money was always tight. I was trying to make a call, and you put your money in, and all of a sudden a flood of coins came out. Yeah, every once in a while things will break your way, right?
Do you remember how much money you actually got when that just kind of opened up?
It wasn't that much, maybe about $5, but it was like $100 the way the impact of it, right? Yeah, it's just found money,
How did things develop? I think you mentioned JC Penney, so you did computer science. You had a way to get school paid for and all of that.
No, I actually studied biology because I was hoping to go to medical school, and I actually packed up and was going back to Jamaica, and then change of plans. I did get a job though at JC Penney. I remember trying to get a job was tough because I started taking the subway to interview, and that became expensive real fast. So I said, well, forget that. I'm going to write letters. So I think I wrote like 100 letters to different companies. I only got one response, and that was JC Penney. Said, well, we have this training program. We're going to train people to be computer programmers. Come in for an interview. And they took me. And I think what did it for me was I only taken 2 computer courses. But what impressed them was that I was in a debate team in college. Even though I didn't think we did that great, but she said, "Oh, that counts for a lot." And I said, "Okay, if you say so." And so they were impressed with that. And next thing you know, I was in a training program. And after about a year and a couple of years there, they had an opportunity in Atlanta, Georgia. I said, "Well, that's warmer weather." By then I was married and I had a daughter. It seemed like an opportunity for us. We could buy a house, and the cost of living was cheaper and so on. So we took it and we moved. They moved us. They sent the movers and they packed up everything, including our garbage. They packed everything they saw. I said, "Hey, that's garbage."
So before we get into the Atlanta piece, I'm wondering if you can share with us, like as a young person growing up in Jamaica, you're from mixed heritage, of course, and Jamaica is
Right.
considered largely a Black or people
Right,
from
exactly.
African descent in the country. Like,
Yeah.
what was it like for you growing up? I know that it sounds like your dad made some unfortunate decisions and
Right.
so forth. What was it like going to KC back then?
Yeah, I always lived very close to the school, so it became a central part of my life. In other words, on every weekend I would go over there and watch some game, cricket or whatever, because I was just, like I said, I didn't have a lot of friends, so I would go over there, and they had a chapel, so I went to church there. We had church every day.
Yes, very
Right.
popular in Jamaica
Yeah.
church.
So, so I was into the religious thing. Even as a boy, I remember in the country, we'd go to church. They had meetings at night, and we had missionaries too. I think at one point we had a missionary. Some people came from America, and they would have a nighttime meetings, in the area, and I'd go to that. And they had Sunday school, so we took part in that too. So we moved a lot. So I always felt that pressure, I always felt that, it was unstable, and I never knew, when. Well, so before I even started, that's when we had that eviction thing. So, that
Wow.
that just, was back of my mind. Oh my God, yeah, this could happen again. And then my father would come home, and he wouldn't have any money, and we had some uncertain times. Let's put it that way.
And for a young
But,
teenager just trying to focus on school, I can
right,
imagine.
exactly. Yeah, and I could tell that when he died, that my whole concentration fell off. I could. It was. I think I had a cold for 2 years. I got sick
Wow.
after that. Yeah, my whole immune system took off, and I was struggled with my nose is always running. I was sick for a couple of years. Yeah, it was really very, very quite a trauma. Yeah.
I hope you had a somewhat or of a semblance of the Jamaican culture and enjoying the food and
Yeah. So
so forth. Like,
when I look back on it now, I'm amazed at the things that I was able to do. I mean, I went to football games. I remember going to Carib Theater, Regal, to watch movies. I think the Drifters came one year, and I ended up going with a friend. I don't know where I got the money, but somehow something always worked out. While I was going through that, I felt tension. But now that I look back at it, I'm amazed that, oh, I did that. I can't believe it. I mean, I went to the National Stadium. I went to, all of these things. It was incredible. I soaked up the experience. I was in a play at school. I didn't do anything. I think I just stood there like a guard or something. But and then as a reward, they gave the whole cast tickets to see the pantomime at the Ward Theater. So I took part in things like that. And
that's good.
yeah, so I did.
That's good.
I did it. I went through it, but I didn't really luxuriate in it. I didn't have the. It was under some constraint.
I get it. The kind of emotional instability of like what was going on at home. You did get exposed to like some very good
Oh yeah,
activities
yeah,
in Kingston. That's good.
sure, yeah, definitely took in a lot of the. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and Kingston College has a good reputation, I know, as one of the
Yes,
great, the good boys school
certainly,
in
yeah.
Jamaica, right?
We got some good training there. We had some good teachers. Also had some bad teachers, but I did well. So I made it to A levels, so I did sixth form, and I
Okay.
think I got a very good preparation. So when I came to college in the United States, it was actually easy, relatively speaking, because in having done like A levels, you know, most things were somewhat a lot easier. I mean, I'd never gotten 100 in anything. I took a math test and I gave me 100. I couldn't believe it. Whoa. Because in Jamaica, they graded, if you got 60, that was like exceptional. Yeah,
Yes, right. Yeah.
they were very, I mean, they knew how to give you a complex.
Yeah, that British system is something
Yeah,
else, I
that
tell you.
system is tough. Yeah. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I feel the same way too. And I think a
yeah,
lot of people I've spoken to are like,
I tell
"Woo,
you, yeah.
we're flying over here."
Yeah. And I noticed that. I've noticed over the years that kids, I think if you have a kid in America, you send them to Jamaica for the first 10 years and then bring them back. And it's all downhill for them because it's a completely different, and the training is so much better. And, even my primary school, I look back on that now. I'm still friends with some of my colleagues from primary school. I can name several of them. I have lunch every time I go to Jamaica with the young man, the old man now that I used to sit beside in primary school.
That's so good, right?
Yeah, so we still have those, but we got a good preparation. I remember in preparing for the common entrance, right? Remember in those days that I think before independence, there's only a couple thousand kids could go to high school. And then after independence, they kind of opened up a little. So it was very hard, you realize that if you didn't go to high school, then you're relegated to just a couple more years of primary school. But in that our particular school, the year before you took the exam, they had you stay back every day, 1 hour after school, and you were in a class. There's a classroom of everyone, and they would give you write an essay and you did some math, and you just did that over and over. So when you got to the exam, I think a lot of kids passed. So it was we really were on a very good school for that.
I can relate to that. Putting the extra time after school
Work, yeah.
to get prepared for the
Just
CXC.
go through that motion, that extra. Well, I think Malcolm Gladwell has this saying that if you want to be good at something, you need to put in 10,000 hours, right? And if you do that for basketball, hey, you're probably good. But if you're not tall, then it probably doesn't help you that much. But if you put 10,000 into doing your work, your schoolwork, you'll probably learn something.
I visit my teachers, my high school teachers. Every time I go back home, I'm still in touch with my English lit teacher, my French teacher, my history teacher, and others. And I have so much respect for them because I realize just how much they poured into us.
Right.
And without prejudice, they poured into all of us children just so much, And I understand that they're hiring, the US and other places are hiring teachers from Jamaica because they're highly sought after. I really do think those teachers' college do very well in preparing these people.
Yeah. The system there has its strong points. Yeah. Well, definitely, you have to do the work. I think in America they tend to gloss things over, and I realize that doesn't really work for some people.
At some point, you really need to develop in order to survive it to come. And now it's a global marketplace, so
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to be able to compete. So, but on to that transition to Atlanta. Tell us a little bit more about what it was like, transitioning with your child and family to Atlanta and trying to find a place, and what life was like back then in Atlanta, in Georgia.
Right. So this is the 70s. I think I was the only person, if I recall, that left New York to go there from that department. And everybody said, we can't leave Broadway. I said, well, I'm go there that often. And so, but everybody said, you sure you want to go to Atlanta? There's Ku Klux Klan. There's people drive around with shotguns in their pickup trucks, and they're painting this. So I said, well, yeah, you may have a point. But I did read, I think in that year, National Geographic had a story about Maynard Jackson, who was the first Black mayor of Atlanta. And I think he was on the cover. So I read that and I said, well, I mean, it can't be that bad. They have a Black mayor, so what? So I said, let's roll the dice. And it's warmer and, a lot better than living in New York. And so we made a plunge. And so first thing, though, looking for a house, right? In that time, the Ku Klux Klan used to have an annual convocation in Stone Mountain in the park. I mean, they just meet for like a weekend over there. And I said, hey, send me the other side of town. in the West Side. I don't want to be near those guys. So I ended up, getting a house in Marietta. And it turns out that it was a lot, I didn't see a lot of activity in terms of the, Ku Klux Klan or anything. But an unfortunate incident occurred, I think the first few months. I was going to work early in the morning because I started working at 7, so I left in the dark in the winter months. My tire blew up about a few miles down the road. And when I looked at it, I realized that it wasn't like a flat. The rim had fallen apart, the side of the tire. So I said, okay, fine. I changed it and I went to work. And at the end of the day, I'm coming back. I look at my car in the parking lot and there's some writing on the back of the car, like somebody painted or whatever, defaced the car. So I said, oh, well, somebody in the garage probably, just went through and mischief, But when I got home, I noticed the same markings on my mailbox and in front of my driveway. My goodness, what is this? And the letters were DDD. That's really what they painted. So I didn't know what it was. Back then, I didn't even take a picture. I didn't have, cell phone wasn't around back in those days. So I just said, well, I have no idea what it is. So I cleaned up as best I could. But then a couple of weeks later, a friend came to visit and said, and I was explaining to him, and he's a much older guy, and he's an American and living in the South and everything. And he said, that might have been the KKK, but they didn't want to put KKK. They put DDD. And I said, oh my God, you kidding? And immediately after he said that, I put my house on the market. And I said, we're moving. So I moved I moved into the city of Atlanta, closer. So from then on, I always lived in the Black neighborhoods. I said, well, I'm not taking any chances, I don't want to be a martyr or brave or whatever. But yes. Within a few years, though, everything had changed. People started moving in. Jamaicans started coming. I tell people that when I first came to Atlanta, you could not get a patty if your life depended on it because there just wasn't, the restaurants weren't there. But yes. Overnight, Jamaicans came in droves, and there are restaurants everywhere. And before you know it, you go in the supermarket and you hear somebody talking patois. You go, oh, where are you from? It was like that, it was like crazy, but it's an amazing. So I've seen a lot of changes in my 40 years in Atlanta.
And then you mentioned then after JC Penney moving on with Coke, that's a nice story as well. Right. So I was very fortunate. A colleague had gotten a job, had left JC Penney and gotten a job at Coca Cola. And I just happened to see him at lunch. So in other words, as you say, back in the day, we didn't have we weren't texting or anything. I just happened to run into the guy, just at one lunchtime, and he said, "Oh, they're hiring in my department. Why don't you apply?" And so I did, and they took me in. They accepted my application. Coke was forming a wine division. They were going into the wine business. Most people don't know that they did that because they only had it for I think 4 years, and then they decided it wasn't a good fit for them, so they sold it. And then all of a sudden, all these people were without jobs. So they said, okay, you guys can have the first pick on any jobs in the corporate. You get a first selection. So they gave us preference, so to speak. So I got a job in the market research area. And it turned out, I was there over 20 years. Really very interesting. I got to travel. There was a lot of traveling involved. And I think I mentioned that I'd been to South Africa once, after Coke had divested during the apartheid era. Mandela came out, was released from prison. He became president, and all of a sudden it was business on again. So Coke sent a team to evaluate getting back into the business and getting the customers up to standard. And so I was part of a team that did that. And we did surveys. We visited a lot of customers. And it was a great experience. I really had a great time. I went to Soweto, the township. I went to a gold mine. I started taking pictures, and they almost took away my camera. It was something else. But that was quite an experience. And what I noticed was that the whites spoke very highly of Mandela. They were so relieved that there was no bloodshed after he came out of prison. He handled that in a very graceful manner.
So that was great.
Join us again next time for part 2 of this episode.
Friends, as always, please subscribe, comment, and share if you enjoyed this interview. If you're passionate about telling immigrant stories, our team is looking for help. If you're willing to help with podcast production, social media, or Patreon management, please reach out to us. You can also donate on our Patreon if it's easier for you. All the links are in the description below. Thank you.
We thank our listeners around the world, and we appreciate your continued support as we build our human library. Please remember to give us a 5-star review, subscribe, and share with your friends, family, and circle of influence.